In the past, I used to think about what my life would be like if I had no parents. If my mom and dad were gone, at times it would fill me with angry joy, and other times it would fill me with panic and fear. 2 years ago, my parents went on a trip to go see a family friend who lived a few hours away, that they had met in high school. I didn't particularly like them. They always talked to me like I was 3 years old, but they were nice enough. However, this time when my parents asked me if I wanted to go with them, I said no because I had too much homework. A few hours later, I received a panicked phone call from my aunt saying that my parents were hit by a drunk driver and were taken to the hospital. At that point, I didn't know what to think. I didn't ask if they were okay or not. I just jumped into my car and drove down to the hospital as fast as I could. When I got there, I ran up to the counter and asked the secretary where my parents were. I'd never been so scared in my life. She asked me for my name. I forgot. My mind was blank. I couldn't remember my name or my parents' names. I could only think of Mom and Dad. I stood there for a few seconds staring at her with panicked eyes, and she asked me again. And I somehow managed to stumble out our names. The secretary took me to the room my parents were in. The rooms were right next to each other. I was greeted by a doctor with sad eyes. My stomach dropped like a rock. The look could only mean one thing. The doctor told me the story of how my parents were driving on the street when a drunk driver swerved into their lane, going the opposite direction. He crashed into my parents going about 60 miles an hour, and my parents were in critical condition. The doctor told me one of the best and worst things I've heard in my life. He told me that my mother was going to be fine. She had some broken bones, but she'd be fine. Then he told me the other news. He told me that my dad's head was hit extremely hard, that his ribcage was completely crushed, and one of his ribs had punctured one of his lungs. He told me my dad wouldn't make it. I just stared at him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I started screaming. Where is he? Where is he? The doctor took me into the room my dad was in. The feelings I felt when I saw him I can't explain. He just didn't look like my dad. There was blood on his head and his face, and the nurses had tried to clean it up, but the reminiscence of it was still there. I stared at him for I don't know how long. Finally, I felt the doctor's hand on my shoulder. He looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry." I became furious with him. He turned around and started yelling, "Why can't you help him? Why aren't you helping him? Go help him now." The doctor grabbed my hands and told me there was nothing they could do. They told me that he had severe brain damage that would kill him even if they were able to fix his lung and ribcage. There was no hope for him. I walked over to my dad and just looked at him. I grabbed his hand. He felt cold. I could hear the beeping of the heart machine behind me. I started crying again and hugged my dad. I so wished he could hug me back. I started sobbing, "Dad, I love you. Don't die. I love you." I felt him move. I jerked back and stared at him. He started opening his eyes and he looked at me. We must have looked into each other's eyes for what seemed like forever. He smiled at me. I grabbed his hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back. I was still crying, but I was smiling at him. He gave my hand one final squeeze and closed his eyes, and his hand went limp, and his smile went away. I heard a long beep that behind me continued for minutes. I sat there holding my dad's hand. I didn't want to let go. I had the feeling like if I just held on long enough that the beep behind me would go away, but it never did. The doctor came and turned off the machine and took the tubes out of his nose and the little plastic thing off his finger, and he stood me up and started to take me out of the room. When we were about 3 feet from the door, I pushed the doctor away and sprinted back to my dad, and I hugged him, sobbing. I started screaming again, "Dad, don't die, don't die, please don't die, I love you, don't die." I cried for what seemed like years, just holding on to my dad, thinking that if I told him I loved him enough, he would come back to life. I was thinking that he could be one of those miracles that when the person dies, they're dead for a few minutes, but then the little machine starts beeping again and the person comes back to life. But that little machine never started beeping again. Like a child, I started to get tired because I was crying for so long. I dropped to the floor. The doctor picked me up and walked me out of the room and set me down in a chair. I felt so helpless and weak. I felt like I was in a dream. Even now, it doesn't seem possible. After a few hours, the doctor came up to me and asked me if I wanted to see my mother. I agreed. I walked into my mother's room and we just looked at each other. We both knew what had happened. I ran up to her and hugged her. In the old, I used to think so what I'd live would be like if I had no primary units. If I primary unit female and I primary unit male were gone, at times it would fill I with ungood good, and other times it would fill I with a double plus ungood. 2 years ago, my primary units left on leave to go view a plus unit who lived minus hours away. I had an ungood view on them. The plus talked to me like I was 3 years since birth, but they were good enough. But this time, when my primary units questioned me if I wanted to go with them to view the plus unit, I speak no, because I had plus secondary education labor. A plus hour after, I acquired a phone call from my secondary primary unit female, speaking that my primary units were hit by an intoxicated driver and were taken to the medical center. At this time, I did not know what to think. I did not question the female if they were good or ungood. I jumped into my vehicle and plus moved to the medical center as plus fast as I could. When I entered the medical center, I moved to the primary counter and questioned the primary table female where my primary units were. The female questioned me my title. I unremembered. My head was unfilled. I unremembered my name or my primary unit's title. I could only think of primary unit female and primary unit male. I stood there for plus seconds, viewing the female with plus and good eyes. I was able to speak our unit's titles. The primary counter female took me to the room my primary units were in. The rooms were next to each other. I was greeted by a doctor with ungood eyes. My stomach fell like a rock. That view could only mean one thing. The doctor spoke to me the story of how my primary units were driving on the street when a drunk driver went double and straight in the opposite direction. He crashed into my primary units going 60 miles per hour. My primary units were in critical condition. The doctor spoke to me, one of the plus double plus good and on the plus double plus ungood things I've ever listened in my life. The doctor spoke to me that my primary unit was going to be good, but my primary unit's male head was hit double plus unsoft, that his rib cage was crushed, and one of the ribs double-holed his lungs. The doctor told me my primary unit male would not live. I viewed him. I could not believe what I was hearing. I started double plus speaking. Where is the primary unit male? Where is the primary unit male? The doctor took me into the room my primary unit male was in. The feelings I felt when I saw my primary unit male I could not explain. He did not look like my primary unit male. There was blood on his head and face. The secondary doctors had tried to clean it up, but it was still unclean. I plus viewed him for I do not know how much time. I felt the doctor's hand on my shoulder. He viewed me and spoke. I am sorry. I am sorry? I became double plus ungood with him. I turned around and started double plus speaking. Why can you not help my primary unit male? Why are you not helping my primary unit male? Go and help my primary unit male now. The doctor grabbed my hands and spoke to me. There was nothing they could do. That he had double plus ungood brain damage, and that would kill him even if they were able to fix his lung and rib cage. There was no nothing for him. I moved over to my primary unit male and viewed him. I grabbed my primary unit male's hand. He felt unwarm. I could hear the beeping of the heart machine behind me. I began crying and hugged my primary unit. I so asked that my primary unit male could hug me back. I started double crying. Primary unit male, do not unlive. Do not unlive primary unit male. I felt him move. I moved back and viewed him. Primary unit male started opening his eyes. He viewed me. We must have viewed each other's eyes for a double plus time. Primary unit male smiled at me. I grabbed his hand and plus grabbed it. He plus grabbed it back. I was still crying, but I was smiling back at him. He gave my hand one final plus grab and unopened his eyes. His hand went double on hard, and a smile went away. I heard a long beat behind me that went on for minutes. I sat there grabbing my primary unit's hand, and I did not want to ungrab his hand. I had the feeling that if I grabbed on for plus time, the long beeping behind me would go away, but it never went away. The doctor came and turned the machine on and grabbed the tubes out of his nose and the small plastic thing on his finger. He had me stand and began to take me on in and out of the room. When we were about 3 feet from the door, I pushed the doctor away and double plus moved back to my dad and hugged him double plus crying. I began double plus speaking. Primary unit male, do not die. Do not die. I plus cried for plus hours, grabbing onto my primary unit, thinking that if I spoke to him, he would come back to living. I was thinking that he could be one of those unnaturals, that when a human dies, they are only dead for a time, but then the small machine begins beeping again and the human comes back to living. But the small machine never started beeping again. Like a secondary human, I began to become unawake because I was crying for double plus time. I fell to the floor. The doctor grabbed me and moved me out of the room and unstood me in a chair on inside of the room. I felt so unhelped and unstrong. I felt like I was in an untrue state of mind. After plus time, the doctor came up to me and questioned me if I needed to see my primary unit female. I spoke yes, and I moved into my primary unit female's room and we viewed each other. We both knew what had happened. I double plus moved up to her and grabbed her.